Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is pig. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or the ways that you'll hear this verb used. The most common way to hear the verb pig used is to mean to eat a large amount of food. So, generally, when we think of this definition, we really kind of think of someone almost to the point of overeating, over consuming. Maybe they're taking away or taking more of their share as well. So, many connotations come to mind with this particular verb and eating a great deal. Now, a second and far less common way to hear this verb used is to talk about the animal that is giving birth to what you might think of as baby pigs or piglets. Now, I asked a couple farmers about how often they use this verb, and I got some negative responses that it's not that common. This might have been something you heard a long time ago. So I would focus on just knowing this first definition of the verb. Now, you should know that pig is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, we're going to have a little spelling change. We've got a one-syllable verb that ends in the pattern of consonant, vowel, consonant. And this means that anytime I add a suffix that begins with a vowel letter, I need to double that ending consonant. So you're going to see a double G, and then I'll add ing to form pigging. The past tense and participle forms of this verb are going to require that same spelling change because ed starts with a vowel letter. So to form the past tense, I'm going to spell it Pigged. Now our base verb pig makes a voiced sound, and this means that the ed ending is just going to make a d sound. So it should sound like this. Pigged, pigged. Okay. Now, there are two phrasal verbs that I want us to discuss, but again, they go back to that earlier definition where we're talking about eating a great deal of food. One phrasal verb you might hear is pig out, and generally, when people are using this, they're thinking about eating something to excess or perhaps in a gluttonous manner. Again, that idea of eating maybe more than what has been set aside for you, consuming other people's foods as well. So an example of this phrasal verb might be, after the game, we'll pig out, right? So here we're making a plan. Maybe you have heard athletes say something like this, right? They exercise or burn a lot of calories, right? And so now it's like, what can we eat? Another phrasal verb you might encounter is to pig out on. And here, what comes after the particle on is going to be the thing which you are eating to excess or in a gluttonous way. So, an example of this might be, after the game, we'll pig out on pizza, right? So here you've got that extra part. Now we know what are we going to be eating. And I feel like I should note that many times when we use this word pig as a verb, and we're talking about kind of eating a great quantity of something, it's most commonly done with junk food or food that isn't all that healthy. Food that tends to have a lot of fat, a lot of sugar. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody say something like, I'll pig out on apples, right? Which are considered to be nutritious food. So again, I think it's most common to hear this used with unhealthy or junk food. But let's move on and review some verb tenses. Today, I thought we would review the simple present and the present perfect progressive. Let's start with the simple present. We use this verb tense to talk about habits and routines. These are going to be actions that repeat again and again with a certain frequency. The trickiest part of the simple present is that we need to pay attention to our subject. If my subject is I, you, we, or they, then I just use the base verb. I don't make any spelling changes. But if my subject is he, she, or it, then I'm going to add an S to the end of the verb. Let's take a look at an example sentence. They always pig out on Saturday nights. So here, perhaps I'm describing a group of friends, right? And this is their habit, the thing they do every Saturday night. Now, if I had been talking just about one person here, I would make sure to add an S and say something like, she always pigs out on Saturday nights. Okay. Now let's move on and talk about negative sentences in the simple present. To do this, I start with my subject, and if the subject is I, you, we, or they, I use do not and then the base verb. If the subject is he, she, or it, I use does not and then the base verb. You might hear the contractions don't or doesn't, and that's fine. I've got an example of that here. She doesn't pig out very often. Right? We're kind of describing the absence of a habit or routine. So it's not something this particular person does regularly. Okay? Now, if you want to ask a question in the simple present, you start with do or does. Right? Then comes our subject, then the base verb. Here's an example. Right? Do you pig out? Right? I always like to point out to my students, notice that the only time I'm adding S to the end of the verb is when my subject is he, she, or it, and in affirmative or positive sentences. I'm not doing it in negative statements, and I'm not doing it when I ask a yes or no question. Now, let's move on and talk about the present perfect progressive. Some teachers and some books, and of course some YouTube videos, are going to refer to this as the present perfect continuous. And that's great. It has the exact same meaning. When we use verbs in the present perfect progressive or present perfect continuous, we're describing actions that started in the past and are continuing into the present. They may even continue into the future. The reason I like saying present perfect progressive is that long name of our verb tense here, you'll notice, has 3 letter P's. And those 3 P's can help me remember that I need 3 parts to my verb. In the present perfect progressive, I need to pay attention to my subject. If my subject is I, you, we, or they, then I'm going to use have, then been, and then the ing form of the verb. But if my subject is he, she, or it, I'll use has, then been, B-E-E-N, and then the ing form of the verb. Let's take a look at an example sentence. We have been pigging out on ice cream lately. Right? So this is an action started in the past. It's still continuing at the moment that I'm speaking or writing this. If I want to make a negative present perfect progressive sentence, then again, I pay attention to my subject. If my subject is I, you, we, or they, I'm going to use have not or haven't, then been, and then the ing form of the verb. If my subject is he, she, or it, I'll use has not or hasn't, been, and then the ing form of the verb. Here's another example. He hasn't been pigging out since he started a diet. Finally, you can ask yes or no questions in the present perfect progressive. To do this, you start with have or has, whichever form matches our subject. That subject comes next. Then you're going to see the participle been, and then the ing form the verb. Here's another example. Have you been pigging out in the cafeteria? Okay. Now, let's move on and talk about some words and phrases that are related to our verb pig. And it might not surprise you that we're going to start with the noun form of this word. The noun pig has the exact same spelling and the exact same pronunciation. There are a number of ways to use this noun, but we're going to talk about two. The first is to talk about the omnivorous hoofed mammal, right? That has a flat snout for rooting around in dirt or soil. So, an omnivore is something that can eat plants or meat. Right? And that is describing this particular animal. I've got a picture on my screen right next to our definition and example sentences. So, how you might hear somebody use this noun in a sentence might be something like, they are raising 5 pigs on their farm. Okay. Now, a second way pig gets used is in a really negative or derogatory way to describe a human who maybe is greedy, dirty, or unpleasant. An example of this might be, my roommate is such a pig. So that is probably going to have the meaning of dirty. I think for most people, when they're using the word that way, dirty is something that comes to mind because the animal tends to live in muddy pens or muddy areas. So I think that's the connection that many people make. Another related word you might encounter is the adjective piggish. This adjective is describing something that is greedy or unpleasant. So, kind of greedy, not sharing, taking more than maybe what has been set aside for you, taking stuff that belongs to others. So, an example of this might be, I can't stand their piggish behavior. So, I could put the word greedy in that sentence. I think it would pretty much have the same meaning. Let's talk about a couple phrases you might encounter with pig. So, you might hear the phrase to make a pig of oneself. This isn't going to surprise you that this phrase is just another way to say overeat, to overconsume. An example of this might be, do not make a pig of yourself on your first date with her. Right? So maybe someone is giving advice to their friend, and generally, overeating is not thought to be kind of a polite thing to do, and it might not help one's first impression of someone whom they're beginning to date. The last thing we're going to talk about is kind of a silly phrase. It's when pigs fly. And many people use this to respond to something that they think is just impossible or is very unlikely to happen, right? So I think you're most likely to hear this used in conversation. So we're going to pretend friend A says, I'm going to win the lottery, right? Friend B is like, oh, you've got one in I don't know how many 100 million chances, right? So they say, yeah, when pigs fly, right? So their friend B is expressing their belief that this is not going to happen. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.